Okay, my name is Luke Lashbrook, and this is my Geo 251 Weather and Climate research project on one of the 5 themes of geography. We're going to focus in today on the recent earthquakes that have been happening in Mexico City over the last few months, some of the effects that they've had on the region, the people there, the infrastructure, why they happened, and what their prognosis might look like moving forward. Um, we'll jump on in here. Mexico City is the capital of Mexico, capital city of Mexico. Um, Around it, you'll find many different climates. They vary from tropical to desert-like climates. It can be arid, it can be temperate. Um, it's a very, very densely populated city. Almost 9 million people in a very small space. So it's not, too crazy to think that, a major natural disaster like an earthquake would have just a massive effect on a lot of people that are kind of crammed into a very small space. So that, and it's kind of wedged in between the Caribbean and the Pacific. It's landlocked. It doesn't touch any bodies of water, but it does feel the effects of being near 2 very large bodies of water. So that does play a big role in a lot of its climate. So like I said, being in the middle of the country like that, it's going to experience very, not drastic necessarily, but just varied degrees of temperature and weather. Earthquakes, by definition, are sudden violent shaking of the ground, sometimes causing great destruction, and as a result of the movement of the Earth's crust or volcanic action. So we all know what earthquakes are. It's literally just a lot of them are mostly situated around plate tectonics. They can be volcanic in nature, but the epicenter is the point at which the earthquake is initiated. From there, waves of tremors can be felt for sometimes hundreds of miles, depending on the size of the earthquake. So obviously, the more violent the earthquake, the more severe, the higher the magnitude, the further its arms and waves are going to stretch. Most of the time, the epicenter, or very near the epicenter, is where most of the damage can be found. And so it's only natural to kind of focus in on that point. More information about earthquakes with a small diagram in there. Earthquakes, there we go, are almost always caused by plate tectonics. They're measured by seismographs and scored on the Richter scale, determining how severe they are and the magnitude with which they are felt. It's estimated that over 500,000 earthquakes occur each year, and they range in all different sizes and intensities. A lot of times people might not even feel an earthquake. They can be very mild. And so, for an earthquake to do as much damage as these earthquakes have done in Mexico City should let you know that they were very severe. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But if you can look on the graph to the left there, this one happens to take place over a body of water, but anywhere 2 plate tectonics meet, most of the action is underneath the crust in the lithosphere, where oftentimes one tectonic plate will collide and slide above or below another tectonic plate, and it's with that friction that you'll see a lot of the seismic activity. So with that comes all the tremors, the shaking, the death and destruction that are often associated with large-scale earthquakes. Plate tectonics is just a theory explaining the structure of the Earth's crust and many associated phenomena of plates moving slowly under the Earth's mantle. So kind of like we touched on just a second ago, it's kind of like just these constant moving, shifting, large masses of Earth that can sometimes collide and cause a lot of problems, mostly earthquakes. Plates move and shift into and on top of one another, like I said, causing enormous friction, and it's on those boundary lines, oftentimes, you'll see a lot of that seismic activity. The thing about Mexico is it lies and what's called the Ring of Fire, or just the fault line of two tectonic plates, the Cocos and the North American tectonic plates. And a lot of times, these occur, of course, all over the world, but a lot of times that's where you'll see the most activity. So, moving right along, that's why we have a history of earthquakes in Mexico City. Due to the location, it's not too far fetched to think that if we know what we think we know about plate tectonics, then the earthquakes that have been occurring for as long as we've recorded them in and around Mexico City are due to the shifting plate tectonics. They've been keeping track of the magnitudes of earthquakes in and around Mexico City as far back as the late 1700s, and since then there have been more than 60 earthquakes with a 7.0 magnitude or higher, and that is really strong. And some of the strongest earthquakes in the world occur in this region, and that's just like we talked about, due to the shifting of the plate tectonics and some of the volcanic activity below the Earth's crust that results in a lot of these really strong earthquakes. As you can see, some of the destruction there on the right side. The strongest one in recorded history was early on, probably the reason they started recording a lot of these. It was an 8.6 magnitude earthquake in 1787. It was a long time ago, and they've had several since then that have come close to that. But I just imagine how that must have felt to feel the whole earth shake underneath you with such ferocity that, luckily we haven't had anything like that around here. Why is Mexico City in trouble? The plate tectonics and the volcanic activity around that region are just really unpredictable. You can kind of measure what kind of activity is going on currently, but at any given time, a major shift or some sort of eruption could happen below the Earth's surface that you just can't predict. It's just we don't have any way of knowing. Seismic activity sometimes seems to be increasing, and that's just the best we can tell, at this time. And the funny thing about Mexico City is it's literally built on top of a dried lake bed. So there's been rumors, I guess, for a long time since it was built as an old Aztec capital, that the city is literally sinking. And so because of that, the ground itself, of which the buildings and the homes are built upon, is not the most stable, and any sort of shift in the Earth's surface, like an earthquake, would have that much more effect on the people and the infrastructure that live there. So it's like building a house on sand almost. It's not ideal. And I'm sure going back, if they could change it, they would probably build their city somewhere else. But they are where they are, and so they think they do their best to deal with what they have. Fault lines. Fault lines are the intersection of two tectonic plates, essentially. And I'm not sure how well you can see in the diagram there, but it's typically where the most violent seismic activity occurs. The fault line of the Cocos and the North American plates meet very near Mexico City, and it's highly active. So if you can see, just in there is Mexico City, or in the cities surrounding Mexico City. Cocos is a small tectonic plate, but it rubs up against the Pacific and the North American plates, and those are highly active. So that big Pacific plane there, the ridge of that is what's known as the Ring of Fire, and that's typically where you'll see a lot of the seismic activity around the globe. Of course, they happen in other places, but that is typically the most active. The most recent earthquakes here in Mexico City, the first one occurred on September 8th, 2017, and it registered as an 8.1 magnitude earthquake, which is aggressive. The epicenter was about 60 miles off the southwestern coast out in the ocean. So that's, for an 8.1 magnitude earthquake, that's plenty close enough to have a ripple effect that clearly did a ton of damage in Mexico City and the surrounding towns. And then it was just a few days later, 11 days later, obviously, on September 19th, 2017, that a second earthquake occurred, and it registered at a 7.1 magnitude, which is still a really, really strong earthquake. And the epicenter of that earthquake was about 75 miles from Mexico City, near a city called Puebla. And what's interesting to note about these is just the timeline from which they happen. It's one thing to get an 8.1 magnitude earthquake, and just as you're recovering from the damage and destruction, you think you're kind of in the clear. Boom, another one hits you a week and a half later, and so any progress that you've made in that time is all undone. Any, the body count, the missing people, where do you even begin to clean up when all of a sudden your world is turned upside down again, and everything you've known has kind of fallen back to where it was just a week prior. More information on these earthquakes. As you can see, there's where the two earthquakes struck, one just off the coast there, a little southeast, and the other almost due west. And the 8.1 magnitude earthquake is actually the strongest they have had in about a century. And it's estimated that it was felt in some capacity by as many as 8 million people, which is just kind of mind-blowing. 8 million people, that is outside of Mexico City. So, obviously it was felt by the almost 9 million people in Mexico City itself. There were aftershocks and tremors that continued for up to a week. And it even generated a small tsunami of waves off the coast that were measured as high as 6 feet above average. So, as you can see, the magnitude here, this happens to be the September 19th earthquake with a 7.1 magnitude. It's just amazing to me that the destruction that was caused by the first earthquake, which was, like we talked about, massive, probably pales in comparison to the damage that was done by the second earthquake coming along and really wiping out the rest of the infrastructure. And that's what's taking the rebuilding process so long. It's just hard to make any sort of progress when, you got double the bad luck, essentially, and boom, another earthquake right there. Death toll and destruction. There was around 2 million people affected outside of Mexico City, including the 9 million people in Mexico City, and up to almost 2 million people without power for weeks and months. A total of nearly 500 people died in these earthquakes. They're no joke. Like I said, being on top of a lake bed, it's hard to have a steady foundation, and when that happens, it's the death tolls will quickly rise as buildings collapse and roadways fall apart, and it's a massive effort to overcome a lot of that. The search and rescue missions continued for weeks after this, even well beyond the expected survival rate of being buried in a situation like that. And the second to all that is the money aspect of it, in which over $1 billion in damage have been estimated in Mexico City, which is kind of unfathomable. $1 billion is a big number, so it's hard to imagine just how much of the relief efforts that worldwide have been going towards, just how much of that does really help. It feels good to help when you can, but I guess a little bit goes a long way. But it's going to take a lot of work and a long time for that damage to be undone. The effects on the region, like we talked about, it'll take years to rebuild, and maybe it'll never be exactly the same, depending on how frequently the earthquakes continue to hit. Roads, buildings, the homes destroyed. It's impossible to put a value on some of those things. Just the manpower behind it alone is what's going to be most impressive. That way people can band together, even outside of the towns, cities, and countries. It takes a worldwide effort to overcome some of this stuff, and a lot of people's lives will never be the same. Um, the region is still unstable to this day, both structurally and economically. When you take a multi-billion-dollar hit to your economy, it doesn't just turn around overnight. And structurally, I mean, think of all the roadways, the bridges, the buildings that have to be rebuilt. And that's a process that doesn't just happen. So that, and along with the idea that the knowledge that where you lie on that fault line, another earthquake could occur at any time. It's a sense of impending doom, I'm sure, that keeps the region. Hopefully, that keeps them prepared, at least mentally, as best as they can be, to know that at any time we could start this whole process over again. And the future risk is, like we talked about, because of where they are located, there'll always be a risk of seismic activity, and it's difficult to predict when an earthquake may occur. But science is learning more and more with every event that small predictors of when earthquakes may occur. And with the recent destruction, another earthquake could be even more catastrophic, just like we saw, with the two they had within 11 days there. The infrastructure should be made to withstand as much damage as possible, and they're taking precautions and all the measures necessary to ensure that the buildings are sturdier, the homes are less susceptible to damage, the roadways are just stronger and built as well as possible. But again, with an 8.1 magnitude earthquake, there's only so much you can do. So put all that together, and it's just a very difficult situation they have down there. It's hard to fathom a lot of the damage that they've done, that they've seen, that the earthquakes have done, and you can kind of only wish them the best as they move forward. But in a lot of ways, the region doesn't ever really recover. It just moves on in a different way, and hopefully they don't have to go through any of that ever again. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much.